The morning of March 3, 1943, arrived with perfect clarity over the Huon Gulf near New Guinea. Officers standing watch aboard the Japanese destroyer Yukikaze had their attention drawn to something approaching from the southern horizon. What they observed through their optical equipment seemed to defy basic military logic. A dozen twin-engine aircraft were racing toward them at an altitude so minimal that the spinning propellers were actually creating visible disturbances on the ocean surface below. This wasn't the kind of bombing approach anyone in the Imperial Navy had trained to counter. Within a quarter of an hour, these observers would see their entire understanding of naval combat operations shattered along with most of their convoy. The ships carrying nearly 7,000 troops desperately needed for operations in the Southwest Pacific would be reduced to burning hulks scattered across the sea. 4 escort destroyers that had successfully protected convoys since the opening days of the war would join them on the bottom. The final tally would include almost 3,000 Japanese military personnel dead, along with every assumption the Imperial Navy held about how aircraft were supposed to attack ships. These weren't standard American bombers executing conventional attacks from altitude. These were heavily modified B-25 Mitchell aircraft transformed by an unconventional engineer named Paul Gunn, whose nickname was Pappy. Each plane mounted 850 caliber machine guns firing forward, turning them into something more resembling aerial battleships than traditional bombers. What was about to unfold would prove that American adaptability had produced a weapon system the Japanese military establishment literally couldn't comprehend. These aircraft didn't release their ordnance from thousands of feet above their targets. They skipped bombs across the water like flat stones while simultaneously pouring torrents of armor-piercing rounds into anything that floated. The convoy that had departed Rabaul shortly after midnight on the 1st of March represented Japan's final serious attempt to reinforce Leh through surface shipping. General Hitoshi Imamura commanded the 8th Area Army, and his forces absolutely required these reinforcements to maintain their hold on New Guinea, which represented the last barrier protecting the southern approaches to the Japanese Empire itself. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura had command of the escort group, which consisted of 8 destroyers drawn from the most experienced units in the Imperial Navy. Shirayuki, Shikinami, Uranami, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Asashio, Arashio, and Asagumo formed a protective screen around the 8 transport vessels. The merchant ships Ayomaru, Kenbu Maru, Kyokusei Maru, Oigawa Maru, Shinai Maru, Taimei Maru, Teiyo Maru, along with the naval auxiliary Nojima, carried the elite soldiers of the 51st Division, nearly 7,000 men total, plus all the ammunition and supplies needed to sustain operations at Leh for months to come. Every aspect of the convoy's departure had been carefully calculated. Japanese weather forecasters had predicted 3 solid days of storms that would provide ideal cover from American aerial reconnaissance. 100 Zero fighters operating from bases in New Britain and New Guinea would maintain continuous air superiority over the convoy route. The ships would hug the northern coastline of New Britain, minimizing their exposure time in open waters where they'd be vulnerable to attack. Captain Tamichi Hara, who commanded the destroyer Yukikaze and would later write an important memoir titled Japanese Destroyer Captain, had noticed some troubling patterns in recent American tactical approaches. Enemy bombers were attacking from progressively lower altitudes, and their aircraft were appearing with strange modifications he hadn't seen before. According to accounts recorded after the war, when Hara voiced these concerns to superior officers, they were generally dismissed as paranoid speculation. The prevailing view among senior commanders was that American desperation was causing them to make increasingly reckless tactical errors that would ultimately work in Japan's favor. What none of these Japanese officers knew was that a complete revolution in aerial combat doctrine had been taking place in workshops scattered across Port Moresby and Townsville over the previous months. Major Paul Gunn, who held the nickname Pappy and had transitioned from naval aviation to the Army Air Forces, had spent the period since August of 1942 systematically transforming medium bombers into weapons nobody had seen before. Guns' innovations emerged from brutal necessity rather than theoretical planning. When bombers attacked ships from 10,000 feet using traditional methods, they achieved hit rates below 1%. From that altitude, even the most skilled bombardiers struggled to strike moving targets. Ships could observe bombs falling through the air and had ample time to execute evasive maneuvers. Anti-aircraft fire proved highly effective against aircraft operating at medium altitudes. Something radically different was required if bombers were going to seriously threaten naval vessels. Using salvaged components from wrecked fighters, Gun installed 450 caliber machine guns in the nose section of B-25 aircraft, replacing the transparent bombardier's compartment with solid metal. He mounted 4 additional guns in packages attached below the cockpit area, creating a total of 8 forward-firing weapons. Each individual gun could discharge 850 rounds per minute, with each projectile traveling at 29,010 feet per second. When fired simultaneously, a single modified B-25 could deliver 6,800 bullets per minute in a concentrated stream of fire. Major Ed Larner's 90th Bomb Squadron, operating as part of the 3rd Bomb Group, had dedicated weeks to perfecting what became known as skip bombing technique. Flying at 200 feet altitude or even lower, they would release 500-pound bombs equipped with specially configured delay fuses that caused the weapons to skip across the water's surface before impacting ship hulls. The fuses were set to detonate 4 to 5 seconds after release, providing just enough time for the bomber to clear the blast radius. The technique had been practiced extensively on the wreck of the SS Pruth sitting in Port Moresby Harbour, where crews could practice until they achieved consistent accuracy. Through trial and error, optimal parameters were established. Altitude needed to be maintained between 200 and 250 feet, with airspeed between 200 and 250 miles per hour, and bomb release occurring 60 to 100 feet from the intended target. The protective storm cover the convoy had been counting on began breaking up earlier than weather forecasters had predicted. At 10 in the morning on March 2nd, a B-24 Liberator conducting reconnaissance operations spotted the ships through a gap in the cloud formations. Within hours, 28 B-17 Flying Fortresses from the 43rd Bombardment Group were airborne from Port Moresby and heading for the convoy. The B-17s executed their attack from 7,000 feet, lower than their typical operating altitude, but still above the effective range of most anti-aircraft weapons. They bracketed the convoy with 1,000-pound demolition bombs. At 2:45 in the afternoon, the transport Kyokusei Maru took direct hits on her forward cargo holds. Fires spread rapidly to ammunition storage areas, forcing the crew to abandon ship. 900 soldiers were evacuated from the burning transport and distributed between the destroyers Yukikaze and Asagumo. These 2 destroyers, now dangerously overloaded with rescued personnel, raced ahead to Leh at maximum speed, depositing their human cargo before turning around to rejoin the convoy early on March 3rd. This emergency run saved those 900 men, but reduced the convoy's escort strength at precisely the wrong moment. What Japanese commanders didn't realize was that the B-17 attack had served multiple purposes beyond simply trying to sink ships. It was reconnaissance by fire, testing defensive capabilities and forcing the convoy to break its tight formation in preparation for what was coming next. Allied planners had deliberately employed high-altitude bombing first to assess anti-aircraft capabilities and scatter the convoy formation to make it more vulnerable to subsequent attacks. The 3rd of March dawned with dangerous clarity over the Huon Gulf. The convoy had successfully rounded the Huon Peninsula during darkness and now found itself exposed in open water, only 80 miles from its destination at Leh. Safety appeared tantalizingly close. At 7:55 in the morning, lookouts aboard the Japanese ships spotted the first wave of attackers approaching from the south. These aircraft weren't flying at 7,000 feet like the previous day's B-17s had done. They were skimming just above the wavetops, so low that spray from their propellers was clearly visible. As the aircraft closed to within 2,000 yards, their noses erupted with streams of tracer fire. 8 lines of bullets from each B-25 converged on the ships, specifically targeting anti-aircraft positions. Japanese gunners attempting to man their weapons were cut down by the concentrated fire before they could return effective fire. Those who took cover couldn't defend their ships from their protected positions. Behind the strafing B-25s came Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron, adding their own devastating firepower consisting of 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns per aircraft. The combined assault from American and Australian aircraft proved overwhelming, systematically suppressing anti-aircraft defences across the entire convoy. At precisely 10 in the morning, Major Ed Larner led 12 B-25s of the 91st Bomb Squadron into their attack run. Flying in flights of 3 aircraft at 200 feet altitude, they bore down on the convoy at 250 miles per hour. This was the culmination of months of training and preparation. The lead bomber released its weapon approximately 300 yards from the transport Shinai Maru. The bomb struck the water, skipped twice across the surface, and slammed into the ship's hull just above the waterline. 4 to 5 seconds after release, exactly as the delay fuse was designed to function, it detonated inside the cargo hold, literally ripping the ship apart from within. The transport Kenbu Maru, loaded with drums of aviation fuel, took a skip bomb amidships. The explosion ignited her volatile cargo, creating a fireball that rose 500 feet into the air. She disintegrated within seconds, leaving only burning debris floating on the water. The Io Maru absorbed multiple direct hits in rapid succession. Her hull was opened like someone had used a can opener on tin. The Oigawa Maru, attempting desperately to maneuver away from attacking aircraft, took bombs from 2 different B-25s simultaneously. Her back was broken by the explosions. She jackknifed and went down within minutes. The destroyer Asashio, commanded by Captain Yasuo Sato, raced to position herself between the attackers and the transports she was supposed to protect. She was immediately bracketed by 3 B-25s. Skip bombs slammed into her engine rooms, while thousands of machine gun bullets swept her decks clean of life. Dead in the water and burning, she became a stationary target for following attack waves. By 10:15 in the morning, exactly 15 minutes after Major Larner's first bomb had been released, 7 of the 8 transports were either sinking or already sunk. 3 destroyers, including Asashio, Arashio, and Tokitsukaze, were mortally wounded. The Shirayuki would sink later that day. The convoy had ceased to exist as an organized military force. The destruction of the ships was only the beginning of the human tragedy that unfolded. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, many of whom couldn't swim, were thrown into oil-covered waters of the Huon Gulf. Those who could swim faced a terrible choice between attempting to reach the New Guinea coast through shark-infested waters with dangerous currents or clinging to debris hoping for rescue that might never come. The destroyer Shikinami, one of the few escorts still operational, began pulling survivors from the water. Captain Masamichi Ueno's crew worked frantically, hauling men aboard as fast as they physically could. They saved approximately 300 in the first hour of rescue operations. Then American planes returned for follow-up attacks. The subsequent attacks on March 4th specifically targeted lifeboats and rafts. Machine gun bullets churned the sea into foam. Life rafts disintegrated under concentrated fire. PT boats also participated in preventing Japanese survivors from reaching shore, following orders to ensure enemy soldiers didn't succeed in reinforcing the Leh garrison. For Japanese military observers who survived to file reports, the attack revealed devastating truths about American innovation. The skip bombing technique, developed and perfected in just a few months, had no counter-tactic in existing Japanese doctrine. Ships couldn't depress their anti-aircraft guns enough to hit planes flying at mast height. Torpedoes couldn't be aimed at aircraft. Traditional anti-aircraft doctrine was completely useless against this new form of attack. The B-25's firepower was particularly shocking to Japanese observers. Standard Japanese fighters typically carried 2 light machine guns, occasionally supplemented by 20mm cannons. These bombers carried 8 heavy machine guns, representing the combined firepower of multiple fighters, all aimed forward and controlled by a single trigger. Even more disturbing from a Japanese perspective was the coordination displayed during the attack. The assault involved American B-17, B-25s, A-20 from the 3rd Attack Group, and Australian Beaufighters representing over 100 aircraft from different units, different services, and even different nations, all working in perfect synchronization. They communicated throughout the battle, adjusting tactics in real time based on radio reports from pilots already engaged with the convoy. As night fell on March 3rd, the surviving Japanese destroyers returned to the battle site, searching desperately for survivors in the darkness. They found a sea covered with debris and corpses. Oil fires still burned on the water's surface in several locations. The destroyer Hatsuyuki arrived from Kavieng with fuel supplies, allowing the rescue operations to continue through the night hours. In total, 2,700 men were pulled from the water and eventually returned to Rabaul. Another 1,200, including those who had been landed at Leh before the main attack, eventually made it to their destination. Of the 6,900 troops who had departed Rabaul with high hopes of reinforcing New Guinea, 2,890 were dead. The 51st Division had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force before its soldiers had fired a single shot at the enemy. All the ammunition, food, medicine and equipment needed to sustain operations for months had gone down with the transports. The aviation fuel that the Kenbo Maru had been carrying, fuel that was supposed to keep Japanese aircraft flying, was now just an oil slick on the Bismarck Sea. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, received the battle report in his cabin aboard the battleship Musashi anchored at Truk. According to staff officers present at the time, he sat in complete silence for a long period before speaking. The implications were immediately clear to him. Japan could no longer reinforce its forward garrisons by surface convoy anywhere within range of Allied aircraft. The lifeline to forward bases had been cut. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked far more than just a tactical defeat in one engagement. It represented a fundamental shift in how warfare would be conducted in the Pacific theatre. Never again would the Japanese attempt to reinforce their garrisons by surface convoy within range of Allied aircraft operating from established bases. The strategic implications rippled through Japanese planning at the highest levels. General Imamura personally flew to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo to deliver his report. In a meeting that lasted 6 hours, he presented evidence that American air power had evolved beyond Japanese ability to effectively counter it. The Americans weren't just building more planes in greater numbers. They were fundamentally revolutionizing how aircraft fought. On March 25, 1943, a joint Army-Navy Central Agreement on Southwest Area Operations designated operations in New Guinea as having priority over those in the Solomon Islands. But without the ability to reinforce by sea, it was essentially an empty gesture. Japanese forces in New Guinea would fight without hope of significant reinforcement or resupply for the remainder of the war. For the Americans, the victory validated 2 years of innovation and adaptation to Pacific conditions. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, had transformed his force from a traditional bombing unit into something unprecedented in military history, an aerial navy capable of controlling sea lanes without requiring ships. Major Ed Larner, whose 91st Squadron had led the skip bombing attack, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership during the battle. The citation praised his extraordinary achievement in leading the attack that destroyed the convoy. Tragically, Larner died just 58 days later, on April 30, 1943, when his B-25 crashed on landing at Dobodura airfield. He had survived 87 combat missions, only to die in a routine landing accident. North American Aviation Company immediately began incorporating guns' field modifications into factory production lines. By late 1943, B-25G models were rolling off assembly lines with built-in forward firepower, including even a 75mm cannon, though the cannon proved less practical in combat than machine guns. The B-25H model would carry 14 forward-firing machine guns. The B-25J could be configured with 18 guns, making it one of the most heavily armed aircraft of the entire war. Beyond the strategic and tactical implications, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented profound human tragedy on a massive scale. The 2,890 Japanese who died weren't just statistics in a battle report. They were sons, fathers, husbands who had lives and families. Many were conscripts who had been farmers, clerks, or students before being drafted into a war they barely understood. For the American pilots involved, the military necessity of preventing enemy soldiers from reaching shore didn't make the actions any easier to bear psychologically. Some aircrew reported experiencing nightmares about the strafing missions for years afterward, haunted by what they had been ordered to do. The success at Bismarck Sea triggered an acceleration of American tactical innovation across the theatre. Within months, new techniques were being developed and implemented. Parafrag bombs, which were parachute fragmentation weapons for attacking airfields that allowed low-level bombing without the aircraft being damaged by its own explosions. White phosphorus bombs for marking targets clearly for following waves of attackers. Improved skip bombing fuses with more reliable delay mechanisms. Each innovation built on fundamental industrial capacity advantages. Americans could afford to experiment because failure cost only material resources, and material was essentially unlimited from American production. Japanese innovation increasingly stagnated because every experiment consumed irreplaceable resources that couldn't be replaced. By contrast, Japanese forces increasingly relied on spiritual rather than material solutions to their problems. The kamikaze concept, using pilots as guided missiles, emerged partly from recognizing they couldn't match American technology or production. If they couldn't outbuild or out-innovate the Americans, the thinking went, they would try to outdie them through superior willingness to sacrifice. Crucial to the victory was American code-breaking capability that Japanese commanders never suspected. The Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne and Naval Intelligence Units in Washington had decrypted Japanese messages revealing the convoy's exact schedule, route, and composition. General Kenny knew exactly when and where to strike, allowing him to position his forces for maximum effect. This intelligence advantage had to be carefully protected through operational security. Reconnaissance flights were deliberately staged to discover the convoy, maintaining the fiction that visual observation rather than signals intelligence had provided warning. The deception was so successful that Japanese forces never realized their codes were compromised, continuing to use the same encryption systems throughout the war that American cryptographers could read almost as easily as plain text. The Royal Australian Air Force's role in the battle demonstrated the superiority of Allied coordination compared to Japanese operations. RAF Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron and Bostons from No. 22 Squadron flew alongside American aircraft, communicating on the same frequencies and following the same tactical plans. This level of integration stood in stark contrast to Japanese operations, where Army and Navy units rarely coordinated effectively, often actually competing for resources rather than cooperating against the enemy. Behind the modified B-25s that destroyed the convoy lay an incredible supply chain stretching back thousands of miles to American factories. Each B-25 required 165,000 individual parts manufactured in dozens of different states. The .50 caliber ammunition they fired was produced in plants scattered from Connecticut to California, with billions of rounds manufactured during the war years. The skip bombing technique required special delayed action fuses manufactured by the millions in American munitions plants operating around the clock. The fuel for training flights came from Texas oil fields and Louisiana refineries, processing crude oil at unprecedented rates. Replacement parts for damaged aircraft arrived weekly by ship from the United States, despite the enormous distances involved. This entire supply chain operated while America was simultaneously fighting in Europe, supplying Britain and the Soviet Union with massive quantities of equipment, and maintaining forces across the entire Pacific theater. The Japanese convoy destroyed at Bismarck Sea represented Japan's absolute maximum effort to reinforce New Guinea. The forces that destroyed it were a tiny fraction of overall American production capability. The American pilots who devastated the convoy had averaged 400 flight hours before entering combat operations. They had practiced skip bombing for weeks using virtually unlimited fuel and ammunition supplies. Each pilot had dropped dozens of practice bombs before the actual mission. By contrast, Japanese pilots entering combat in 1943 increasingly had less than 100 hours of total flight time. Fuel shortages meant minimal training opportunities. The veteran pilots who might have taught them proper techniques were dead, killed by the industrial mathematics of American production superiority. New Japanese pilots were essentially flying students thrown into combat against experienced American aviators with hundreds of hours of flight time. After Bismarck Sea, Japanese forces in New Guinea were strategically isolated in a way that couldn't be remedied. Supplies had to be delivered by submarine, which was dangerous and extremely limited in cargo capacity, or by fast destroyer runs at night, which were equally hazardous and insufficient for major operations. These so-called Tokyo Express runs could deliver only a small fraction of what the destroyed convoy had carried. The Japanese turned to using barges, attempting to creep along the coast at night with supplies loaded on small craft. These became prime targets for PT boats and modified B-25s equipped with radar for night hunting operations. By June 1943, Japanese forces in New Guinea were on half rations. By September, they were literally eating grass, tree bark, and roots. The army that had conquered Singapore was starving to death, defeated not just by bullets but by interdiction, the systematic cutting of supply lines by air power. For Japanese military culture, rooted in centuries of samurai tradition emphasizing personal combat and individual heroism, the industrialized slaughter at Bismarck Sea was incomprehensible within their worldview. Japanese forces would increasingly resort to suicidal tactics like banzai charges and kamikaze attacks, seeking meaningful death in the face of mechanized killing they couldn't counter. Americans would respond with more technology, more firepower, more industrial solutions. The gap between traditional warrior culture and industrial warfare would only widen as the war progressed. Pappy Gunn had installed cameras in the tails of modified B-25s that activated automatically when bombs were released. These cameras captured the destruction of the convoy in devastating detail, showing ships exploding, capsizing, and burning. The photographs provided unprecedented documentation of the battle's effectiveness for multiple purposes. They provided accurate battle damage assessment, allowing intelligence officers to verify pilot claims of ships destroyed. They became training aids, showing future pilots exactly how skip bombing worked under actual combat conditions. They served as propaganda tools, demonstrating American power to allies and enemies alike. The Japanese had no equivalent photographic capability, relying instead on pilot reports that were often wildly inaccurate in the heat and confusion of combat. The B-25s that destroyed the convoy had been flying continuously for months in the harsh conditions of New Guinea. Tropical heat caused metal expansion problems. Humidity bred corrosion on every exposed surface. Coral dust abraded engines and created maintenance nightmares. Yet mechanical failures during the mission were remarkably rare. American engines were over-engineered with power reserves that allowed them to function even when not perfectly maintained. Japanese aircraft, by contrast, were designed to tight tolerances with minimal safety margins, making them extremely vulnerable to combat damage and difficult to maintain under field conditions. American and Australian aircraft communicated constantly via radio during the battle. Pilots reported target locations, warned of fighter attacks, and coordinated approaches in real time. This information sharing multiplied combat effectiveness exponentially, allowing aircraft to support each other and exploit opportunities as they emerged. Japanese communications were minimal and often completely non-functional. Radio equipment was notoriously unreliable. Frequencies weren't standardized between services. Radio discipline was poor. Ships and aircraft often fought in complete isolation, unable to coordinate effectively or warn each other of threats they had detected. American pilots flew into battle knowing that if shot down and wounded, they had excellent chances of survival and recovery. Blood plasma, morphine, sulfur drugs, and eventually penicillin were standard in American medical kits. Medical evacuation by air was routine procedure, with wounded pilots often in hospitals within hours of being shot down. Japanese soldiers and sailors knew that serious wounds likely meant death. Medical supplies were desperately short even before the convoy's destruction. The medicines that might have saved lives were now at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. This knowledge affected morale profoundly. American pilots flew with confidence born of knowing their nation valued their lives. Japanese forces fought with the desperation of men who knew they were expendable. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea cost Japan ships and aircraft it absolutely couldn't afford to lose. The 8 transports represented months of production from Japanese shipyards already strained beyond sustainable capacity. The destroyed supplies and ammunition represented significant portions of total Japanese production that couldn't possibly be replaced given industrial limitations. For America, the battle was economically insignificant in the larger context. The ammunition expended was replaced within days from existing stockpiles. The few aircraft lost were replaced within hours from reserves. American factories were producing 100,000 aircraft annually by 1943, nearly 300 per day. The fuel burned in training and combat was a rounding error in American petroleum production capacity. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea reverberated through the remainder of the Pacific War in ways that extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. It proved conclusively that air power could control sea lanes without requiring naval vessels to be present. It demonstrated that industrial innovation could create entirely new forms of warfare faster than enemies could develop effective counters. For Japanese forces throughout the theatre, it marked the beginning of the end in the Southwest Pacific. Cut off from reinforcement and supply, they would fight a series of desperate holding actions, each ending in annihilation or starvation. The island-hopping strategy became viable specifically because Japanese garrisons could be isolated and bypassed, left to wither without supplies, while American forces moved on to more strategic objectives. The success at Bismarck Sea accelerated B-25 development programs dramatically. The B-25G entering service in late 1943 carried a 75mm cannon, the largest weapon ever mounted on a twin-engine bomber at that time. Though the cannon proved less practical than multiple machine guns in actual combat, it demonstrated American willingness to experiment with radical concepts. Each iteration of the aircraft reflected lessons learned in combat and industrial capability to implement changes rapidly. Post-war analysis of captured Japanese documents revealed how thoroughly the Bismarck Sea defeat had shaken Japanese confidence at the highest strategic levels. Intelligence reports from the combined fleet emphasized American material superiority rather than tactical superiority, representing a significant shift from earlier assessments that had attributed American successes to luck or Japanese tactical mistakes. One captured report stated explicitly that the enemy's production capacity allowed them to implement new tactics faster than counters could possibly be developed. This recognition of fundamental industrial disadvantage marked a crucial shift in Japanese strategic thinking. After Bismarck Sea, Imperial General Headquarters conducted a comprehensive review of overall strategy in the Southwest Pacific. The conclusions reached were sobering in their honesty. Surface reinforcement of forward bases was no longer operationally possible. American air power had achieved operational supremacy that couldn't be challenged. The industrial gap was widening rather than narrowing. Japanese strategic options were becoming increasingly limited. The skip bombing technique developed for Bismarck Sea proliferated throughout American forces with remarkable speed. Navy Catalinas adopted it for night attacks on Japanese shipping. Marine Corps pilots used it in the Solomons campaign. Even transport pilots were trained in the technique in case they encountered enemy shipping while on other missions. This proliferation was possible because America had standardized training, equipment, and communications across all services. A technique developed in New Guinea could be implemented in the Aleutians within weeks. Japanese forces, divided by severe service rivalries and poor communication, rarely shared innovations, even within the same theatre of operations. The raw numbers tell the story of American industrial supremacy that made the Bismarck Sea victory possible in the first place. During World War II, American factories produced 9,816 B-25 Mitchell bombers total. Ammunition plants manufactured 12 billion rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Flight schools graduated 193,440 pilots. Every B-25 component was stockpiled in multiple locations across the Pacific to ensure availability. Against this industrial tsunami, Japanese military courage was essentially irrelevant. The bravest samurai warrior couldn't overcome the basic mathematics of mass production. Pappy-Gunn's camera installations provided unprecedented documentation of combat effectiveness that could be studied scientifically. The footage, analyzed frame by tactical experts, revealed optimal tactics with precision. Bomb release at 200 to 250 feet altitude produced best results. Approach speed of 245 miles per hour was ideal. Release distance of 60 to 100 feet from target ensured maximum effectiveness. This scientific approach to warfare, systematically measuring, analyzing, and optimizing every variable, was quintessentially American in character. War became an engineering problem with industrial solutions rather than a test of warrior spirit and courage. The loss of supplies at Bismarck Sea created an immediate economic crisis for Japanese forces throughout New Guinea. Within weeks, frontline units were reporting critical shortages across the board. Ammunition was restricted to 10 rounds per day per soldier. Rice rations were reduced to 400 grams daily, well below sustenance levels. Medical supplies were completely exhausted with no prospect of resupply. Fuel for vehicles was unavailable, grounding most motorized transport. Aircraft were grounded for lack of spare parts and fuel. American forces, by contrast, complained if ice cream wasn't available daily at their bases. The economic disparity was so vast that captured Japanese soldiers often refused to believe American supply levels were real, assuming they were being shown propaganda displays. Success at Bismarck Sea accelerated American innovation in aerial warfare across multiple areas. Within months of the battle, new developments were being fielded, including improved skip bombing fuses with more reliable delay mechanisms, napalm for area attacks on Japanese positions, rocket-assisted bombs for increased penetration against hardened targets, and white phosphorus markers for improved target identification. Each innovation built directly on industrial capacity to experiment and implement changes rapidly without resource constraints. Americans could afford failed experiments because they cost only material resources. Japanese innovation stagnated because every experiment consumed irreplaceable resources in a resource-starved empire. Behind every B-25 that attacked at Bismarck Sea stood a maintenance crew that kept it flying under incredibly difficult conditions. These men, working in primitive jungle conditions in New Guinea, performed daily mechanical miracles that kept the aircraft operational. Engines were overhauled in jungle workshops with improvised tools. Battle damage was repaired using whatever materials were available. Modifications were implemented with basic hand tools under field conditions. Aircraft were turned around between missions in just hours when necessary. This maintenance capability reflected fundamental American industrial training advantages. Hundreds of thousands of Americans had technical skills and knew how to fix engines, repair electrical systems, and work metal. This vast pool of mechanical expertise was perhaps America's greatest military advantage that nobody talked about. The strafing of survivors in the water, controversial even among Americans at the time, served a harsh military purpose beyond just killing enemy soldiers. Japanese forces throughout the Pacific Theater learned that attempting to reach shore after their ships were sunk meant likely death from strafing aircraft. This psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate battle, affecting Japanese morale and decision-making in future naval engagements. General Douglas MacArthur called Bismarck Sea the decisive aerial engagement in the entire Southwest Pacific campaign. His communiqué claimed somewhat inflated Japanese losses, but the strategic impact more than justified his enthusiasm about the results. Air power had definitively proven it could interdict sea lanes as effectively as submarines or surface vessels. Admiral Yamamoto, reading the detailed battle reports from surviving officers, made a fateful decision in the aftermath. He would personally visit forward bases to boost morale that had been shattered by the defeat. This decision, driven directly by the depression following Bismarck Sea, would lead to his death on April 18, 1943, when American codebreakers learned of his precise itinerary and P-38 Lightnings intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville Island. American forces institutionalized the lessons of Bismarck Sea with remarkable speed. Within weeks of the battle, training manuals were updated with detailed skip bombing techniques. New pilots were practicing low-level attacks as part of standard training. Tactical doctrine was revised throughout the theater to emphasize anti-shipping operations. The Army Air Force's Tactical Training Center analyzed every single aspect of the battle, producing detailed reports that were distributed throughout the Pacific to every unit that might use the techniques. Japanese institutional learning, by contrast, was severely hampered by systemic problems that couldn't be fixed. Service rivalries prevented honest analysis of what had gone wrong. The Army and Navy blamed each other rather than examining fundamental weaknesses. Face-saving cultural concerns obscured actual failures in planning and execution. By the time Japanese forces managed to develop even partial counters to skip bombing tactics, American forces had already moved on to newer and more effective tactics. The B-25 modifications that proved so devastatingly successful went into mass production almost immediately. North American Aviation's factories in Kansas City and Inglewood retooled their production lines within weeks of receiving reports from the field. By late 1943, new B-25s were coming directly from the factory with 8 to 14 forward-firing guns as standard equipment, meaning every new aircraft had this capability built in rather than requiring field modifications. Several B-25s returned from Bismarck Sea with significant battle damage from anti-aircraft fire. Holes from exploding shells damaged control surfaces. Engines had been shot up by defensive fire. Within 72 hours of landing, every single damaged aircraft was flying again, fully repaired using aluminum patches fabricated in field workshops, engines replaced using improvised hoists and field equipment, control cables spliced together with salvaged materials from other sources, and fuel tanks patched with rubber salvaged from destroyed Japanese equipment. Japanese aircraft sustaining similar damage would have been immediately written off as total losses, then cannibalized for spare parts if anything was salvageable. The delayed action fuses that made skip bombing operationally possible were genuine marvels of precision engineering and manufacturing. They were manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of inches. They had to survive the violent impact of hitting water at over 200 miles per hour. They needed to function reliably after skipping multiple times across the surface. They had to detonate at precisely the right moment, neither too early nor too late. American factories produced these incredibly complex fuses by the millions, with each one individually tested and certified before shipment. Japanese fuses, by comparison, had documented failure rates exceeding 20% by 1943 due to quality control problems and severe material shortages. American reconnaissance aircraft found the Japanese convoy precisely when and where intelligence had predicted, despite weather conditions and enormous distances involved. This reflected multiple layers of superiority in navigation and training. American pilots averaged 400 hours of flight time before entering combat. Navigation equipment included accurate compasses and reliable instruments. Map quality was excellent, with detailed charts prepared from pre-war surveys. Weather forecasting provided meteorological support that accurately predicted when the weather would clear. Japanese navigation increasingly relied on simply following lead aircraft or using coastal landmarks for guidance, which severely limited operational flexibility and range. American intelligence had known about the convoy's exact schedule and route through code-breaking capabilities, but protecting this priceless secret required careful operational security. Reconnaissance flights had to be deliberately staged to discover the convoy through visual observation, maintaining the complete fiction that signals intelligence rather than code-breaking had provided the initial warning. The deception was so thoroughly successful that Japanese forces never realized their codes had been completely compromised, continuing to use the exact same encryption systems that American cryptographers were reading daily like newspapers. The 1,200 Japanese soldiers who eventually reached Leh found a garrison already on severely reduced rations. The massive quantities of supplies that were supposed to sustain operations for many months had been destroyed in the convoy. Within just weeks, Japanese forces were desperately foraging for any food they could find in the jungle. Disease became absolutely epidemic throughout the garrison. Malaria infected huge percentages of the force. Dysentery weakened soldiers daily. Tropical ulcers became infected and wouldn't heal. Malnutrition made everything worse. By June 1943, the effective combat strength of Japanese forces in Leh had been reduced by 60% through disease and starvation alone, without any combat action. American pilots at Bismarck Sea operated under limited combat tour policies, typically flying 50 missions or serving 6 months before rotating home to train new pilots and pass on their experience. This system systematically preserved hard-won combat experience and disseminated lessons throughout the entire force. Veterans became instructors back in the States, passing on actual combat techniques to the next generation of pilots entering the pipeline. Japanese pilots, by contrast, flew continuously until they were killed, which was statistically inevitable. The expertise they gained at terrible cost was lost forever when they died. By late 1943, most experienced Japanese pilots were dead, and their replacements were increasingly poorly trained novices facing American veterans with hundreds of hours of combat time. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented a convergence of multiple American technological and organizational advantages working together. Industrial capacity enabled production of modified aircraft in quantity. Innovation culture encouraged and rewarded field modifications and new ideas. Training resources allowed perfecting new tactics through unlimited practice. Intelligence capability provided precise target location information. Communication systems enabled coordinating complex multi-unit attacks. Supply chains sustained operations over vast distances. No single advantage was individually decisive. Their combination together proved absolutely overwhelming. The Japanese military faced not just superior numbers of weapons, but superior systems across every dimension, industrial, organizational, technological, and logistical, that they simply couldn't match regardless of courage or determination. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea lasted only 3 days total, with the absolutely decisive action occurring in just 15 minutes on the morning of March 3, 1943. In those 15 minutes, the fundamental nature of warfare in the Pacific theatre changed forever and irreversibly. Air power had proved conclusively that it could control vital sea lanes without requiring any naval vessels to be present. Industrial innovation had demonstrated it could create entirely new forms of warfare faster than any enemy could possibly develop effective counters. American production had shown that sheer quantity, when properly applied with sound tactics, possessed a quality all its own that couldn't be overcome. For the Japanese military establishment, Bismarck Sea was far more than just another tactical defeat in a long war. It was definitive proof that their entire fundamental approach to warfare had become completely obsolete in the face of industrial modernity. Traditional virtues like courage, fighting spirit, and martial tradition meant absolutely nothing against modified B-25s, carrying 8 forward-firing heavy machine guns and dropping skip bombs with scientific precision based on extensive testing. The best-trained samurai warrior in history was utterly helpless against an enemy that had successfully industrialized warfare itself into a production process. The 2,890 Japanese military personnel who died in the Bismarck Sea were victims of far more than just American bombs and bullets and strafing runs. They were casualties of a technological and industrial revolution that had fundamentally transformed the nature of warfare beyond anything their training had prepared them for. They had trained extensively for war against other warriors following traditional concepts. Instead, they died in a war against machines, systems, and industrial processes they had no possible way to match or counter. For the American forces involved, Bismarck Sea comprehensively validated years of preparation, training, and innovation under difficult conditions. Pappy Gun's field modifications, developed using salvaged parts and basic hand tools in primitive workshops, had proven more devastatingly effective than any purpose-designed weapon system. The marriage of fundamental American ingenuity with massive industrial capacity had produced an entirely new form of warfare that Japan simply had no answer for and couldn't develop one fast enough. The battle's legacy extended far beyond just the Southwest Pacific theater. It demonstrated definitively that in modern industrialized warfare, industrial capacity directly equals military capacity. The nation that could build the most weapons, train the most personnel, innovate the fastest, and adapt the quickest to changing conditions would inevitably prevail, regardless of traditional military virtues. Traditional military qualities like courage, loyalty, and willingness to sacrifice remained important factors, but they were no longer sufficient by themselves to determine outcomes. In just 15 minutes over the Bismarck Sea, 8 modified bombers accomplished what the entire Imperial Japanese Navy, with all its battleships and carriers, couldn't prevent despite their best efforts. They permanently cut Japan's supply lines and doomed Japanese forces in New Guinea to slow starvation and ultimate defeat. Those 15 minutes marked the precise historical moment when industrial warfare definitively replaced traditional military concepts throughout the Pacific theater. The Japanese soldiers and sailors who witnessed the attack and couldn't believe what they were seeing were absolutely right to be incredulous about what was happening. They were witnessing something that shouldn't have been possible according to everything they had been taught and everything they knew about naval warfare and tactics. But American industrial innovation had made the theoretically impossible into routine standard operating procedure, turning the completely unthinkable into just another day's work. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands permanently in history as definitive proof that in modern industrialized warfare, the nation with the most productive factories inevitably defeats the nation with the bravest soldiers regardless of courage or determination. It was a lesson written in fire and blood across the waters of the Huon Gulf, a lesson that would define and shape the entire remainder of the Pacific War. In the age of industrial warfare, production capacity equals military power, innovation capability equals strategy, and the assembly line is ultimately far mightier than any sword. The Japanese military establishment simply could not accept or believe it when modified B-25 Strafer bombers destroyed 8 transport ships in 15 minutes of devastating attack. By the time they finally accepted this new reality and its implications, it was already far too late to matter. The war had already been lost, not in those 15 minutes of visible destruction, but in the preceding years of industrial preparation and development that made those 15 minutes of destruction operationally possible in the first place. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was simply the dramatic moment when that long-prepared industrial victory became undeniably visible and obvious to everyone who witnessed it happening.